This is the Stick Figure Purpose podcast with Kevin Henson. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Stick Figure Purpose podcast. Today's episode is titled Never Say Never, and I am excited to have here, but more so, a great friend, Interim Fire Chief Chris Renshaw with the University of Connecticut, UConn Fire Department on the podcast today. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for being here.
So my name is Chris Renshaw. As Kevin said, I'm Interim Fire Chief at UConn Fire Department in Storrs, Connecticut. It's a career department with stations on 2 of UConn's 7 campuses. I live currently in Connecticut. I'm originally from upstate New York. Can't hold that against me. I went to school up there and then transferred to UConn in the mid-90s, putting some time frame on where I am in life. And then I did my master's degree at UConn in natural resources, and then stayed for a tremendous career in public safety with a career professional fire department.
That is awesome. So UConn has literally been part of your life for quite a long time. Not calling you old, but UConn's been a part of your life for quite some time. So awesome, Chris. So in addition to doing the chief stuff, and you're the big guy now. You're the interim fire chief, and I'm proud of you. Wish you the best. I know you got a lot going on up there, but in addition to that, I am just fascinated that you also do a little bit of stuff with the U.S. Forest Service. You know a thing or two about wildland firefighting. So What can you tell me about that?
I'm in my 26th season with the U.S. Forest Service as an AD. My current qualification is a task force leader. I've been lucky enough to have, over the last 26 seasons, gone to wildfires across North America, including up into Canada a few times. I'm currently working on my task book for Division Supervisor and Structure Protection Specialist. I started off my fire career back in 1988. Here's my origin story, Kevin. I was sitting on the back porch in upstate New York, just outside of Syracuse, and watching the news on a little black and white television. And they were talking about the Great Yellowstone fires of '88. And it was one of those benchmark moments where I watched the men and women fighting in the Crown Jewel National Park, hitting raging walls of flame, trying to save trees and wildlife against this beautiful backdrop of mountains. And that's what I want to do. That's how I want to spend my life. And so everything that I did kind of moved in a direction to get me there, but life happened. And by the way I say that is, at the time, I was told that the way to get that job was to pursue a degree in forestry. And so that's the direction I went. In high school, I went into forestry school in upstate New York in the Adirondacks. And while I was there, an opportunity came up to study at UConn, moved over there to study wildlife. And along the way, someone said, hey, if that's what you want to do, fight wildland fire. In Connecticut, there's a program that the Department of Environmental Protection, now it's called the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. They take on firefighters, volunteer or career, and they give you the training, and then they send you out west to fight wildfires with the Forest Service. And I was like, well,
wow,
that's the way I want to go. So in order to do that, I got to be a firefighter. So I went down to the firehouse in town, and I volunteered. I signed up, I took the training, and so I started this separate path towards structure fire. So never in a million years would I have ever expected, Kevin, to be an interim fire chief of a career professional fire department, when the goal was all along to be a wildland firefighter. And as a wildland firefighter, I just wanted to be what we call a Pulaski motor. I just wanted to be the person that was swinging the tool and doing the hard work and rising up through the ranks and really taking advantage of the opportunities as they came and they were given to me, which I'm forever grateful for, allowed me to pursue both those. Working with the Connecticut Interstate Fire Crew for years gave me the skills and the connection to be able to become a resource that gets name requested by the Forest Service to lead even their own crews. So in that 26-year span, I've been fortunate enough to now be able to start working on higher level, more authoritative, supervisory positions like division supervisor, and being part of something really unique, which is the Eastern Area Complex Incident Management Team, where I spend to serve the most time now. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you said your name requested. And while I'm no expert in U.S. Forest Service business, I'm a NIMS ICS geek. And so for anybody, whether it's type 3 or type 1 events, if you're name requested by the U.S. Forest Service, I'd say you're probably doing something good and you made a name for yourself. So I'm proud of you. I'm not saying that because you're here on the podcast. You know a thing or two about wildland firefighting. So that's exciting. I know that's your passion. You and I have had a lot of great conversations about this, and I love hearing the stories. And there may be some of those that we get into in a little bit. Going back to UConn. So spending so much time at the University of Connecticut as a student and now as a department head, I guess is what they technically would consider the fire chief, right? So you're a Huskies fan, or you are a Husky because you're an alumni. So you're a Husky.
Yeah, I'm a double Husky. Yep.
So I've done a little research. I know a little bit about UConn. I am not the world's largest basketball fan, but I am a college basketball fan, more football than basketball. So we won't get into football. But interesting, there's a lot of people that like to talk about places like Duke. However, I find that UConn is definitely out ahead of Duke when it comes to the number of national championships. I don't know. I think it says 6. I may have done a little research.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant number.
Yeah, so, I don't know. Back-to-back championships are kind of rare. Not that you guys did it in 23 and 24. I think you did that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well on the way to perhaps a third. Perhaps the first ever hat trick in basketball.
If it's anybody, it needs to be the UConn Huskies. So for any of you out there, if you're not UConn fans, shame on you. UConn?
Huskies.
All right. Had to lob it up for my man. But no, congrats on the back-to-back national championships, and look forward to seeing if you guys can keep that going. So
it's a pretty significant rivalry between South Carolina and UConn, especially when it comes to women's basketball.
Yeah, well, all the South Carolina fans that are listening to this podcast, I am a Garnet and Black myself. I am a big South Carolina fan, so nothing against all our Clemson fans out there, but still got a little love for you. So today, Chris and I, we're going to talk about a lot of things, but we're going to spend some time talking about risk as well as complacency. And when I think of complacency, you hear or see people say things like, this will never happen to us, when we look at large-scale events or low-frequency events. And so we're going to spend some time talking about some of these items and particularly dive off into a few areas that Chris has a lot of experience and has dealt with some of these low-frequency, high-risk, or even extreme-risk events, and just kind of walk through lessons learned and talk a little bit about that. When I thought about this episode, I was thinking of really kind of two buckets. And that was the low frequency, high risk, and then the low frequency, low risk, as well as the high frequency, high risk, and high frequency, low risk. So kind of that quadrant, if you will. But where complacency falls into that, and I'll talk personally about a couple of things, is it's easy now in 2025 to look at, I would say, at least in the Southeast. I'm not going to say nationwide because there's a lot of places that are experiencing different things than we are. But I would say in the Southeast, historically speaking, we have seen a decrease in the number of building fires or structural fires. Not saying they don't happen. It just tends to have been dropping as our risk reduction efforts are increasing.
Right, which is a good thing.
Yeah, that should be a good thing. And I applaud the risk reduction efforts that are out there. And for all of those firefighters that enjoy the job, that's a hard thing to say because we like going to fires. We don't like dealing with the loss that people experience with these fires. But this is what we signed up to do, is to help people. And fighting fires is fun. If you're a firefighter and you say it's not, we know you're lying. We
It's
don't
part
wish that
of the
on
job.
anybody, but that is part of what drew you to do it and
Absolutely.
helping people. So anyways, with all that said, we are experiencing a drop in the number of structure fires, which in the structural firefighting world, I would say that is kind of our go-to event when we think of a low frequency, high risk incident. That's an easy one in my book to think of, is a structure fire, because it's very high risk. It is, something that you have no control over. So you're there to try to get it under control and mitigate it. It's obviously in a confined area, because that's why we call it a building or a structural fire. And there's all these inherent risks. We don't know upon our arrival if there's people inside. So we have to treat it like there are, because we don't know that to be true. So we're putting ourselves at risk when we have to enter that structure for search as well as for a fire suppression. But also the building could be compromised based on the length of time that it was exposed to fire, the building construction, so on and so forth. So very high risk involved. And for most of it, it's a low frequency. It's not happening all the time. So I have really tried to work hard, because I've saw fire chiefs and administrators in some areas look at the data and they see that these things are happening less. Obviously, they're not as frequent as the EMS calls, and they begin to place less emphasis on those, because you'll hear things, well, that's less than 1% of what we do, which is true. It's not an inaccurate statement. They've got data to back that up. I find that to be an area where we need to spend more time because of the less frequency. We don't get the sets and reps, if you will, of going out there and fighting those low frequency events that are high risk. So I find that we need to spend more time focusing our efforts in training and education and learning what we're going to do when we have these, so that we can operate at a high level.
That's right.
So that was the best example kind of in a structural firefighting world. We could dabble off and talk about hazmat, technical rescue, and a lot of other low frequency, high risk events, but structural fires.
Significant events like the celebration of national championships. So it's low frequency, high risk, with factors that we can control and some that we can't, but we're still accountable for mitigating the risk, whatever form it takes. And so when, for example, for UConn, just to tie it back to the introduction with basketball, when the 2 national championships occurred, we had the luxury of using the first one as an example most recently of the number of championships that we've had. The most recent one as a model for conducting an analysis of what worked and what didn't, and what that gap would be for us to improve should the second one start to present itself like the first one did. And so it's not always baked into, in our career as professional structural firefighters or all hazard firefighters, those big buckets that are just fire or just EMS. We share this responsibility and duty, the social contract, if you will, with the people who allow us to do this job that we love so much, to be prepared to give 100% effort towards mitigating that risk. And ideally, the whole life safety, incident stabilization, property conservation motivation, our objectives, to bring that celebration, that structure fire, that EMS call to a successful end or conclusion or a pass off to a higher level of care.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example. I'm at the coast, right? I'm at the coastal area of South Carolina. So while I would say hurricanes are low frequency and they're high risk, it's a little different. We spend a lot of time preparing for those because we're at the coast. We know that we are at risk. We are barrier islands, particularly where I work. So we are constantly looking at ways to be prepared for these events and to enhance our resiliency for when they do happen, to bounce back. Using the hurricane example, I'm from the upstate of South Carolina. I don't know about you, but typically hurricanes don't go through the mountains. That doesn't make sense to me. And back in hurricane season, Hurricane Helene came through the Florida area. And as it came up through the southeast, it absolutely decimated parts of upstate South Carolina. and Western North Carolina. And it was unlike anything I had seen in my short to moderate length lifetime. I'll say that. And so that level of rain and tropical storms, if you will, in a mountainous area where the terrain is not flat like it is at the coast, it did things that we were not used to seeing.
Right.
And I deployed to the upstate and worked out of an emergency operations center, EOC, up there, and had grew up in that area my whole life and had never seen anything like that. It blew my mind. So yet another example of being prepared and ready for something that we really have no idea how catastrophic it's going to be when it happens.
And having the situational awareness to know that you're being presented with factors or indicators that demonstrate to you that you're in new territory. And so whatever systems or procedures or policies or guidelines or even just how we go about doing our job needs to perhaps be modified or tweaked in order to be successful, where it might not be because of this new situation.
Absolutely. And while I can't speak to the intricate details because I was not there when the event kicked off, if you will, what was interesting because of the relationships and the people that I know there and who I worked with later in that week, what was interesting was when the initial storm hit and they were beginning to see, rain and wind and things that was not, they did not necessarily expect to be that severe. In the moment, they were dealing with immediate responses. And so they were overwhelmed. Their resources were limited. They were working through the process of resource request. The issue that I noticed from afar, if you will, was that a lot of people were asking for the same resources. So then it became a demand versus availability. Ultimately, as this thing expanded, it was a beautiful lesson in the incident command system, watching that upstate county really what I would say would be putting on a clinic with, as they started to implement roles such as logistics, they started figuring out, hey, we're going to implement these positions and build out that command and general staff to really manage that event, if you will. And going back to your experience with the Forest Service, when you see that happen, it's a beautiful thing because we all talk about ICS. We go through a ICS 300 or ICS 400 or even the online classes 7 and 800. But when you truly see it working the way it's intended to, you look and you say, man, those guys and gals that put this idea together years and years ago, that's a smart group of people because it works. And again, it's not something that we apply in the structural firefighting world every day. We apply it differently. But when you start working through that command and general staff and you build out those positions and everybody has a role and a task and they know what they are, it gets me excited. And I know that's a nerdy thing to say, but of all people, that would excite you too. So
yeah, absolutely. And there's something to be said about NIMS and ICS in the terms of scalability and flexibility, and how those two things, being able to scale and being able to be flexible, make us better firefighters if we take those concepts and we bake them into how we go about doing our job.
Yeah.
From strategy to tactics.
Yeah.
Just being able to be scalable and flexible leads us to success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So coming back to complacency, as we've talked about these low frequency, high risk events, I naturally am going to walk into the wildland side of things because you have a lot of expertise in that. And so again, being in the Southeast, while we have had wildland fires, they are not to the scale or frequency that our West Coast brothers and sisters deal with, obviously, out in California. And so for South Carolina, I would say, if I'm not mistaken, the largest wildland fire we had was in an urban interface area in Horry County, which is near the Myrtle Beach area. And this was back in 2009. I remember this, and it was an event that, we maybe like 100-year flood, right? That now happens every other year. But this fire truly was like a once in a lifetime event for us, because this is not something that I don't want to say we don't prepare for it, but it's not something that we expect to happen. Going back to that, it's never going to happen to us. And so I don't have an exact number. It was over 70, 75 structures that were destroyed, which for us in the Southeast, in South Carolina, that's a lot, because we don't have these type of events as frequently as others. But that really opened up our eyes, because it took a lot of resources and it took a lot of outside resources coming into South Carolina to help mitigate that. And then fast forward 2016 in the upstate, they had the Pinnacle Mountain Fire. So it was in the Table Rock Mountain area. So it was a little different. Instead of low country, near the coast, like the Highway 31 fire, the Pinnacle Mountain Fire was in mountainous terrain. Mm-hmm. And it was a different type of fire, but that was the last true, I guess, wildland fire that we had here. Again, it required a lot of resources from the Forest Service and out of state to come in and help us. You guys experienced quite a unique set of events in October of this year, if I'm not mistaken, in Connecticut as well. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about I don't want to call it a rash of fires, but it was several. I don't remember the exact number. I just remember hearing about it, and it was a lot of fires. Was it throughout the state? Was it
yeah, it was
a certain
statewide
portion of Connecticut?
Yeah. So first off, because I truly believe that your audience is national, I want to clarify that being a firefighter in Connecticut and talking about wildfires in Connecticut, yes, indeed, we do have trees. So I know that's always a question, right? Particularly when I'm a resource that travels out west to lead and be part of the suppression effort for 100,000 acre plus fires. The first question is, where are you from? And what? You have trees there? So the scenario or the scene I'm painting for you in Connecticut is that we are 3 million acres with 3 million people, but we're mostly forested. In fact, Connecticut has over 70% wild and urban interface or intermix. And that's significant when you talk about percentages for how much space and land that we as fire departments have to manage fire on. And based off the vegetation that grows in Connecticut, our typical fire season is very short, wildfire season. And it is a week or two in March or April when the snow melts, but before leaf out, before the trees and bushes bring forth new growth and have conditions of fuel moisture that aren't receptive to fire. And then we go through the summer, and then there's about a week or two in the fall where the leaves come down, there's no precipitation, the sun goes through the canopy of the trees that don't have leaves now and hits the forest floor, and things dry out and we're available to burn. But then that window slams shut after the week or two when the fall hits and colder temperatures bring rain and everything gets soaked. And typically we have snow cover for most of the winter. We're getting less and less of that, and that's a bigger picture thing. So we have built all of our capabilities and our risk calculations based off of fire seasons that are very narrow with large breaks of time in between. So we calculate everything that we do as far as being prepared for training, our apparatus, the money that we look at allocating towards either prevention or response, all boiling down to these small windows where we would put it into place. And so for an entire year, typically in Connecticut, the number of wildfires that we have, which incidentally, locally, we call them brush fires, which is going to feed into the conversation a little bit later.
Same here. That's typical for our area too.
You call them brush fires?
Yeah. So, well, we won't.
But with your accent, it makes it way more cool. Yeah.
Brush fires. We got them brush fires down here. Brush fires.
So
this on, bro.
Yeah. I can hear Garth Brooks right now.
Oh boy.
The systems that we set up are just for about 100 of these fires a year. That's it. And in the grand scheme of things, like that's important, but it's not as important as things that are higher frequency and maybe even higher risk or even lower risk, just because that window is so small. So fast forward to this fall, we had a few things happen leading up to it where conditions changed. We had way more receptive fuel than we've ever had before, arguably for the last 200 years.
Wow.
Where damage to our vegetation from exotic pests like the emerald ash borer or the gypsy moths, we call them spongy moths now, came through and they defoliated and decimated our deciduous trees that shed leaves. And that left a lot of dead and standing fuel that we hadn't had in great volume, like I said, arguably, since we started converting the forest landscape to agriculture, then back to forest succession, back to agriculture, and now human development and housing is taking that role. So couple that with a few years of drought back in 2014, 2015, and 2016, those conditions left more fuel than we've ever had. So all of a sudden, we get into a drought situation here in Connecticut, and we have this fuel that's ready to burn. And one ignition point in late October turns into the most significant fire that we've had in Connecticut, arguably ever. And although it was only 130 acres, the duration of that one fire was nearly a month long. That had incident management teams come in from FDNY, local, and then international. We had teams come down from the Northeast Forest Fire Protection Compact from Quebec and other Canadian provinces down to Connecticut. And remember, you guys have trees? Yeah. To manage the event and the resources. So that was an eye-opener. But in that 1 month period, Connecticut also experienced statewide 220 fires in less than 30 days.
Wow.
So we're talking about this immediate reaction to events and circumstances that really were kind of beyond any planning effort, any sort of preparation for worst case scenario. And to the greater point, never say never, it happened. And because it happened, we need to, as a fire service, as leadership within the state, and the lessons learned from our experience to everyone, is that we have to now build our capacity and our resources to respond to the potential for this to continue on until the hazard fuel is mitigated, till we see different changes in our weather patterns. But none of all of that looks like it's going to change anytime soon.
I find it super interesting as we're talking about complacency. And it's not always complacency. Maybe this is the term I'm using is when we say never, or it's not going to happen here. We're not used to something of that magnitude happening, much like what we've saw here in South Carolina over the years. You guys weren't used to seeing that magnitude of fire and that frequency when you were talking about over 200 in the course of 1 month. And so your resources, well, one, I doubt any of us have the resources unless we're California to deal with that many fires at the same time. I'm sure it immediately tasked your local resources, your regional resources, and you talked about some that came in. Going back to my fascinated with this story, because I'm going to back up to May of this year. You present research on this very subject. And so when I see these fires breaking out in October, well, one, I start wondering if they're going to track you down because you're like a prophet or you're Nostradamus, because you talked about these very things as part of your capstone research project for the Executive Fire Officer program. Phenomenal research, by far some of the most interesting stuff that I've ever seen. It's just very interesting to me that you took that research. So at that point, you're experienced as a wildland firefighter. You have spent a lot of time in Connecticut, so you know a lot about the landscape. I'd argue you know a lot about the fuel. You've done this research. I don't know if all of you out there believe in things happening for a reason, but if this rash of wildland fires was going to happen, I would argue that coming right off of the research that you had done and it's fresh on your mind, here this happens. Yeah. Talk a little bit about how you applied what you learned through your research into action when you took on some operational roles with those fires in Connecticut.
Absolutely. So the reason I chose the topic I did for the research was I live in these two worlds, one of structural firefighting and one in wildland firefighting. And they're both passions of with a educational background or academic background in natural resources. I feel fortunate enough to able to see things in terms of systems and how they relate to each other, and being able to observe changes in the way the forest health in Connecticut was building these fuels that someday, maybe under the right conditions, would be available to burn, and it would be catastrophic just because of the sheer volume. And then understanding that the reason that they don't burn is because of the ecosystem that we live in New England, and particularly in Connecticut. Vegetative fuel components don't burn on a frequency like we see in Southern California. They burn on a time scale of every 250 to 300 or more years. Any given acre will burn. Whereas Southern California, that can be as little as every 17 years. And so that clock of succession or changes in the landscape and the ability for that vegetation to be receptive to burn, that is a large time frame, but that clock is always ticking. It's always running. And we're always messing with it by converting it to agricultural fields, by paving it, by building houses, by clearing lots, changing the way we manage our forests. Then we got insects that come in and also dabble as well and change the way our forests are structured. So I was able to see those themes, and I thought, man, there's certain things that are coming together that I'm witnessing. I wonder if we are indeed prepared as a fire service in Connecticut. And I wonder if anybody else is paying attention to these factors in the structural fire service, knowing that at some point we're going to be obligated, that social contract, to respond in a manner that represents us as prepared and ready, particularly if we're going to put people in harm's way, our own people. And so looking at those things, I couldn't help but think that we look at fire, go back to IFSDA, the fire triangle, heat, fuel, and oxygen. And if I looked at you and said, hey, turns out oxygen's changed, like it's 1% more in our atmosphere than it's ever been, we would panic because things would completely, like the way we think of fire would be absolutely, we couldn't exist as a fire service model right now. We couldn't exist as a human society. Everything changed, right? But that's the impact of something very small for one of those legs. And the fuel would change, but in itself, things that are able to burn, they burn. And heat, right? And the chemical reaction that brings those things together. We understand that one leg at a time. Over in the wildfire world, we have the same triangle concept, but that's fuel, weather, and topography. And it struck me when I was thinking about how to tie these things together and then bring them back to the structural fire departments in Connecticut was, hey, instead of just thinking about one side of the triangle, we've got two sides now. Nothing's really changing topography in Connecticut. It's mostly flat. The fuel, as I've talked about, has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And then the weather, that's a factor that we can't control, but we can make predictions. And we're good at predicting weather. We really are. So much so that we tend to take it for granted, but we also discount it. And when I say discounted, I'm saying that we turn on the news and we look and we see the 5-day forecast and we think, they get it right a certain amount of time, right? So until the day of, you're never really going to know. In New England, wait 5 seconds and the weather will change.
That's right.
The truth is, we're making these predictions using real scientific knowledge and process to say that things are happening globally. And it doesn't matter how, in my opinion, how we got here, we're here.
Right.
We can scrub the politics, we can scrub
That's
it
right.
all away and
we can't change the past. All we can do is deal with what we're seeing, and what you're talking about is tangible evidence right in front of us of these things. I mean, the change in weather, nobody can argue that. We just talked about it earlier, and how jokingly, and it's not funny, but jokingly, that what FEMA and the NOAA considers a 100 or even 1,000-year flood has occurred half a dozen times in our state in the last 20 years. So that doesn't make sense. So that alone tells you weather conditions are changing. But I would agree with you that our ability to predict it is better than ever.
Yeah, it is.
And the technology that exists, and it's at our fingertips. Literally, we carry computers around on our wrist and in our hand. We have access to all these things. And it just struck me when you said we take it for granted.
Yeah.
Because I think we really do. That's a great point.
And so much so that when something says that global temperatures are rising, and 2024 has been recorded as the hottest year on record since we've been keeping records, and that the long-term analysis says that that's not going to go backwards anytime soon, not in our lives at least. Now we're talking about significant changes in weather, changes in fuel, topography stable. These things are all going to come together. It's just a matter of time. So the timing for my research and the events that happen 6 months later, it's uncanny, but it's predictable. And when we talk about complacency, or we talk about how we approach risk and categorize it in frequencies based off of the level of safety, the level of preparedness, the level of influence it has on us, either as fire departments, as human beings, transportation, commerce, the human condition, we have to be cognizant and respectful of the idea that if we can predict something, we need to start working through what happens if the event occurs and we go from low frequency, high risk to high frequency, high risk, which happened to Connecticut in 1 month's time. And so the social contract is we have to learn from this so that when we have that next window this spring and we're presented with the same conditions, what have we learned from the experience that we just had to be more prepared? And so that was sort of the context of the research, and then how we operate as resources to mitigate that hazard as we move forward into the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I had a note here because I was going to talk a little bit about the role of leadership when it comes to, one, identifying what has occurred historically. So in your case, what happened in October. So we can't bury our head in the sand. We don't want to talk about it. I'm not a wildland firefighter. I would not have connected that unless someone like yourself shared that with me. You opened my eyes to start evaluating what's going on in South Carolina. I would probably say we have some sort of insects or invasive insects in this area that are probably decimating vegetation in our area. I'm not smart enough to be the guy to figure that out, but it's interesting that these are all things. It's not just, I need fire and I need some vegetation for it to burn. You've opened my eyes to the risks that exist, but also the fact that I and others really need to educate ourselves more on that risk, whatever it may be. We're using wildland fire or wildfire in this context. but it's also any risk. And so
That's
from
right.
a leadership perspective in your area, after having 200 plus incidents within a 30-day window, a high frequency, high risk situation, as you talked about, from a leadership perspective, and I'll use you for example, because I know we can't speak for others. What is your takeaway as far as in your department to increase your ability to be resilient and bounce back from these things, but also to be prepared for the next time it happens?
Sure. Yeah. The key takeaways that I saw as opportunities for growth, not only within my own department or the department I lead and belong to, but also the departments that we count on as mutual aid or share the same space in the state of Connecticut with. And that is one of awareness. We saw the event unfold. We need to recognize that the potential for it to happen is here and it's sustainable in the near future to be the new normal. And the takeaways have got to be, well, we're operating our strategies and tactics under a system that we're comfortable with, that we've worked with for all of our careers and all the timelines of those who have passed the torch to us. But the system has changed. And so if we fail to change our strategy, if we don't recognize that the system itself has changed, and we continue to use these same strategies and tactics, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And that change of system is all the things that we just talked about, but the strategy and tactics have got to be recognizing that we equip ourselves, we train ourselves, we build our policies and procedures around the hazards that are within our own jurisdiction. That's our obligation to the people who are paying for our budget, right?
Absolutely.
The taxpayers. But that's the level of service that they're expecting when you're in charge of making sure that you're mitigating the risk for the location that you're within. But we have to recognize that this type of fire event or this hazard doesn't respect those geographic boundaries, given the conditions that we have now.
Yeah.
And it doesn't respect the operational period that we're accustomed to. In Connecticut, responding to a brush fire, typically we can wrap those up just because of the infrastructure of roads and stone walls and transitions of fuels. We can contain those fires in one operational period the majority of the time. And so when we venture into what happened at the Hawthorne Road Fire, where we're now into day 20, we're not built we're not built strategy-wise or tactically to fit that system. And so we exhausted resources very quickly and had to adapt to the ability to draw in additional, which may not be the best fit right away, and then trying to jam those cogs together to make those gears spin. We have to recognize that the level of PPE has to be one that's conducive to the wildland environment, particularly over long durations or multiple operational periods. We can't be modifying structural gear to perform this job. We have to give our people the tools and equipment that are indicative to the job to be done. We have to give them the training on that hazard. It's a different style of firefighting than the vast majority of the departments in our state, which are all hazard or structural based without wildland components. So it's a change in thought. And then recognizing that we have to do all those things and be prepared to respond cooperatively to those events when they're not even in our jurisdiction. So the Hawthorne Road Fire was a great example of mutual aid requests from the local jurisdiction saying we need assistance, we need help, drawing in resources. Departments were responding to assist that didn't have wild and urban interface or intermix. They were urban departments. And having to transition quickly to that environment, no pun intended, to be successful. And so that is the new normal. And we've got to build our capabilities and capacity to recognize that this is going to be a continuous issue, and we have to apply those lessons learned now so that we can produce the best outcome to protect our people and the people that are depending on us to assist them.
I agree. And you talked earlier about adaptability and flexibility and being able to do both of those things because, one, it's an ever-changing risk that we deal with. I look back, I would say probably prior to my time in the fire service, it was just that. It was the fire service. And while that's still a lot of what we do, we now have coined this term all hazards, but that's true. We really are all hazards because there's so much that we're responsible for responding and mitigating because of that social contract that you talk about, that we have to be prepared for so many different things. And it often makes me wonder, can we continue that and be great at all of these things? Because we don't just want to be good enough. Or do we focus on, I don't want to say our bread and butter. Do we focus on what is most applicable to our area? It's a hard conversation because you now have witnessed a wildland outbreak. I guess that's a fair statement to say in Connecticut that could happen again in your area and in other areas. So it's how much focus do you now feel like you should shift into the wildland urban interface, understanding, mitigation, so on and so forth, while still not lessening the amount of time that you're spending because you still have a duty to respond to structural fires, you still have a duty to respond to hazmat and tech rescue and all these other things. So I often wonder at what point, if there is a point, is there a saturation of, I don't want to say stuff, but at what point do we identify where we need to focus our time?
That's right. That's the paradox of leadership too, right?
It is.
Finding that line, that carrying capacity. I think the key to success on this is not only complex, but maybe can be oversimplified. If you could give me that grace to say that we have to determine whether or not we're comfortable as leaders to be able to step away at the end of our careers and recognize whether or not we provided the people that are depending on us to make those decisions with the tools for them to hopefully see the end of their career alive and well and able to spend their taxpayers' money on pension in a great way, right? And that, I feel, is the measure for how much I want to commit adapting our strategies and tactics from all hazard to incorporate additional tools and techniques that maybe utilize more in the wildland urban interface. But I also believe that the takeaways, the understanding of those systems allows us to have more tools in the toolbox to look at things from different perspectives that may inadvertently make us more successful. That there's tools and techniques in wildland that'll make you a better structural firefighter and vice versa.
Yeah. So I think it's a consistency and flexibility. I'll use that term in training, being vigilant, being adaptable, and a commitment from leadership as well as those that are in our charge to be ready and willing. And also there's a culture of safety that we need to talk about as well, because these things continue to grow in complexity and the risk is much greater because now we're dealing with things that we are not as familiar with or maybe have as much experience with. And so finding a way to be prepared, be ready, have a culture of safety, but also be willing to take risk when necessary to save lives and property. And again, going back to that charge of leadership, that's a heavy burden that keeps many of us and other officers and chiefs up at night when you're trying to think about how you balance all of these things, how you prepare your people, because you hit the nail on the head. I feel that in the position of leadership at whatever rank, your role is to provide opportunities and training, tools and equipment that allow your team members to make it successfully through their career, healthy, both mentally and physically, so that when they retire, they can enjoy the life after the fire department with their family. That's what I feel our goal is to get them there. And that is the burden of leadership, is to think about all these other things that are necessary to provide that opportunity for them after the fire service. I don't know the answers to all of these things. I know we do the best we can to provide our people with the information, the knowledge, the equipment, and the opportunities and training to prepare themselves so that they have the best fighting chance when they respond to these events, whether they're low frequency, high frequency, low risk, high risk. They're ready to respond and have a fighting chance regardless of what the situation is. Because I would argue that we always say that we never have the same day in the fire service over and over again. We never respond to, quote, the same call. So then the question is, how do you prepare somebody for something that's ever changing? I'm still trying to answer that question. Yep. I think it's sets and reps and spending time out there, and what we lack in experience, we make up for in training, and providing our people that opportunity to gain knowledge and education and training so that they can fill the gaps they don't have with experience when they're dealing with these things. Take politics out of it. I look at the leadership that we have in the U.S. Fire Administration right now, and arguably, in my opinion, it is the best it's been in my tenure in the fire service. I truly feel like the leadership that we have at the U.S. Fire Administration is placing a focus on a lot of these emerging risks, but also applying technology, which is our friend. And in the fire service, let's be honest, for years, feel like we resisted technology because we're firefighters. We don't need that crap.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
We look at the thermal imaging camera 20 years ago and almost look at it as like, why do I need this? Obviously, now you would never think about entering a burning building without a thermal imaging camera because of what that technology can provide you quickly by scanning the room, not only temperature, heat, victim location, on and on. We'd never think of entering those structures without it now. So going back to the U.S. Fire Administration, I applaud their ability to enhance the technology that we're using and the data that we're collecting. And who knows where we're going to go as we implement, NERIS. But taking that data to help us understand the emerging risk and what's going on so that we can apply it at the local level to, again, set our people up for success by educating them and all these things. I'm excited about where I feel like the fire service is going with the information that we now are going to have at our fingertips on frequency and demand and types of calls. I'm a GIS geek, so I can't help but be excited that, NERIS is driven by GIS data.
That's right.
Again, I applaud their efforts. I think now we're at a place we've never had before with Bob Horton joining the U.S. Fire Administration and the experience he brings from the wildland world. It is very interesting to see the focus on the wildland side, because I think right now, as we talk, what's unfolding in California, there's a need for that. There's a need to understand it more. There's a need to educate people more. There's a need to protect people and firefighters and citizens alike. So hats off to them. I applaud where we're going.
Yeah, and I second that. I'm really proud of where the USFA is moving in and the level of collaboration they have with other professional organizations, including the Department of Defense and the U.S. Forest Service, I think, or the NWCG, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. I think that moving forward successfully means that we're all in it together.
Absolutely. So, Chris, we've talked a great deal about not only complacency, but risk and the emerging risk and the importance of understanding it within our whole community and region. So another risk that I wanted to bring up is tell me a little bit about the risks that exist in your office and in your life when you don't have your favorite cup of joe, your favorite cup of coffee. Are you a coffee guy?
Yes, that's an understatement. There are a few things in this world I could do that I could do without, and that is not one of them.
Okay. So are you a low octane or a high octane?
I am a high octane. I'm a high frequency, high octane coffee drinker. Yes, sir.
Okay, so you don't do the light brown stuff. If I held up a pot of coffee that you made, I'm not going to be able to see the light on the other side.
You will absolutely not. I am okay with chewing parts of my coffee.
I love it. I asked Chance on the last podcast, was he a Folgers or a Maxwell House guy? So I got to know, are you a Folgers or a Maxwell House guy, or are you none of that crap?
The best part of waking up is indeed Folgers in your cup.
Absolutely.
And I will put a wildland spin on this.
Okay, let's go.
Folgers makes an individual serving that is in a flow-through bag like you would find tea. And then on the wildland environment, it's definitely packable. And when you don't have enough time to pull out your jet boil and your AeroPress to make yourself a good cup of joe, Folgers folded over and tucked in your lip, that gives you the kick.
Oh, wow. So we're
yes,
going...
Sir.
We're going straight, dipping the Folgers.
Straight jaw.
All right, today's episode brought to you by Folgers. If you haven't already, get yourself a foldable Folgers and stick it in your lip.
Kids, don't try this at home.
Yeah, don't try it at home. I don't want to see you on the baseball field. I don't want to see you on the baseball field throwing out the big league chew and putting in the Folgers. It enhance your heart rate too much. Don't do it. All right. I agree. I'm a Folgers guy. Don't shoot the messenger if we got anybody out there. I don't get crazy wild into the frou-frou stuff. There's some other good stuff out there. Black Rifle makes some good stuff, but it's hard to beat Folgers. When I see that red can, again, I'm not in the wildland world, so, we got the big can. When I see that red can and you peel back that beautiful silver seal,
you take that first smell,
that aroma hits you in the face, and then the 4 cups of grounds that you put in the filter, because let's be honest, man, you got to get it thick. You got to get it thick. This got to be high.
The dark roast has less caffeine, but I mitigate that risk by volume.
Well, you drink it cold.
Yeah,
you drink it. I knew you would, because
doesn't matter to me.
In the wildland environment, you don't always have the ability to heat it up. So
that's right.
I knew you were a cold.
You
coffee
get what you
guy.
get.
That's right. So great time, Chris. Great time, and we would be remiss if we did not leave our listeners with a little bit of innovation when it comes to community risk reduction. We've talked a lot about risk today, and I feel like we should leave them with an innovative fire safety message. Maybe it's not a full-on fire safety message, but a message related to the fire department that is memorable. So I reached out to Chris when I asked him to be on the podcast, and I said, hey, I'm going to have a little surprise for you. I told him that we were going to have an epic battle of fire safety messaging, an epic battle of fire safety messaging. And there's one thing I know about my friend Chris that he shares with I, and that is a love, not a like, a love for 90s grunge music.
Yes, sir.
Straight out of Seattle.
I'm trapped in that. Absolutely.
Absolutely straight out of Seattle. My favorite part of when Chris would arrive at the National Fire Academy, when he and I were in EFO together, oddly enough, we would arrive like close to the same time, and we do not live near each other. Yep. Yeah, unplanned. And I would not even have to turn around, and I would hear Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, you insert these grunge music here. And I would just know that's my guy. Every single time. That's my guy. Just having a great time. From the parking lot. So, in an epic battle of fire safety messaging, I told Chris, put together your greatest message to the tune of your favorite Pearl Jam song. Because I know you're a big Pearl Jam guy.
Okay.
So, in an epic showdown of Fire Chief Grunge Off, related to the fire service with a message for our listeners that they can carry with them forward. He and I each are going to exchange our best 10 to 12 second. For those that don't know, asking Chris to do anything less than 10 to 12 minutes is a major feat. And I just told the man 10 to 12 seconds. So, all right. So I'm going to hit it first. I'm going to hit it first, mainly because I feel like I'm probably going to crash and burn here. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not edited. So what you hear is what you get. And I'm not a singer, but I'm going full send on this one because I love me some 90s grunge, and I've put together a fire safety message for the ages. And so I'll lead us off, and I'm going to go with a little tune any Pearl Jam fan would know as Even Flow.
Good call. Nice.
I hope I didn't steal your thunder there. And so, in keeping to 10 to 12 seconds,
that's a long time.
I chose to have one line from the verse and then 2 lines from the chorus. So anybody that knows Even Flow should be prepared. And so I apologize for what's about to happen to your ears. I got nothing else for you, but we're going to have a good time. And so as I get ready to sing in my best Eddie Vedder tune, I'm going to hit you with a fire rendition of Even Flow. So stand by. Burning, fire growing faster every minute. Oh, yeah. Sprinklers, wow, 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 looks a lot like useless things. Wow, wow, wow. Oh, hear me say, they keep the fire at bay. All right, that's it, man.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Awesome. Man, you can have the vocal instrumentation, man.
Ooh, I had to do the whammy bar. I had to hit it.
Mike McCready. Yeah, there you go.
Wow, wow, wow. Figured you'd like that. That was just for you.
Absolutely. Hey, listen, they say never meet your heroes, but if I get to meet Eddie Vedder over copyright court because of this, I'll call that a win.
I'm in. Well, hey, we'll meet there with Folgers. Right. With Folgers. All right, you're up, Chris. You're up.
All right. Yeah. So I'm going to go with Jeremy from Pearl Jam.
Solid pick.
I got to get in the zone here. Got to get in the mode.
For those that can't see, because this is an audible podcast, but I can see Chris. And so as he prepares, I'm going to give you about 2 seconds of explanation about what I see. So Chris is in his favorite flannel shirt, and he's got his fist tightly closed, pumping it above his head as he holds the microphone in his right hand like Eddie Vedder would, as he leans forward with his foot on the speaker monitor that's on the stage so that he can hear himself sing. That's the position Chris is in as he gets ready to unleash Jeremy. All right, go ahead, Chris.
At home, drawing pictures of mountaintops with defensible zones, yellow Gatorade, saws raised in a V, and the snags lay in piles of ash below.
Go, boy, go. I love it. I love it. You were great. My ears don't hurt. My ears don't hurt the way that yours probably do from where I see.
Because we're older, we're losing hearing.
And you were committed. Again, you can't see Chris. He had the entire stage presence of the greatest singer you could ever imagine.
I'm climbing up into the rafters for the next
Absolutely. One. That was phenomenal. That was phenomenal. So I heard your wife got to hear this performance. Is that right?
Yeah, I gave her a preview and she laughed.
So we're not going on tour. Those that heard episode 1, I was in a band. I'm going to emphasize one word of that sentence. Was.
I wish I knew about this.
That's a past tense. Was. It's a long time ago. Had a lot of fun, but me and Chris are definitely not going on tour unless it's to the copyright. Oh man, I love it, dude. That was great. That was fun. That was fun. I'm probably going to cry when I listen back to myself sing because I am not a singer. But Chris, man, I can't thank you enough for being here. It's always a great time when you and I have a chance to be together, whether it's across the internet as we're doing here, recording this podcast, or it's in person. I love you like a brother. It's been a great time. Glad to have you on here. Last thing for you, buddy. If you could recommend one person, anybody, to bring on the podcast, talk fire stuff with, talk shop, who would that? Throw me a name out there.
I'm gonna, because I think that your base is going to be heavy on structured fire or all hazards. I'm going to go with a man named Matt Carroll, who works for the Forest Service.
Okay.
He was a smoke jumper in McCall, Idaho, once upon a time. He lived on the same floor in the dormitory in forestry school as me.
Awesome.
But Matt's job is to look at as facilitative learning analysis. So his perception on risk and margin and firefighting in general is very unique and very exciting. So picking Matt's brain, I think, is going to be a great opportunity for you and your listeners.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate that. I love your input, and I look forward to reaching out. And as I say, the worst they can say is no. All right. Well, listen, guys, if you enjoyed today's podcast episode, please share with your family, friends, and anyone else. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and the newly released website, www.thestickfigure.com. We are beyond blessed to have the support of all our listeners and our good friends and guests such as yourself, Chris. Thank you again for being here. I appreciate it. Until next time, just like the stick figure, keep it simple, find your purpose, and tell your story. See you.